Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about how and why modern artists use the Middle Ages in their fiction. And to do that, I want to talk about a book that I just recently read, Umberto Eco's Baudolino, translated from the Italian by the giant of Italian translation, William Weaver. Baudolino is a learned masterpiece in how it depicts the Middle Ages and what it does with that depiction. This book is steeped in medieval philosophy, theology, language, and it so effectively explores so many of the worldviews and cultures of the Middle Ages. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with Umberto Eco, he was a medievalist scholar, and he fused his massive wealth of knowledge on the Middle Ages with his seemingly boundless and endless imagination in his fiction, a lot of which can be termed probably historical fiction, though anyone who has read Umberto Eco knows that his books aren't just historical fiction. What we might call some of his works, Baudolino and The Name of the Rose at least, are works of medievalism. And medievalism is the use of medieval motifs, tropes, cultures, philosophy, setting in modern art, in non-medieval art. And the Middle Ages, through this medievalism, have almost never been more popular than in this past decade. Maybe the Victorians would have something to say about that. And Umberto Eco thought about a lot of the ways that he and others use the Middle Ages, and using is the right verb there for sure. From fantasy literature to TV shows and movies, hell, The Green Knight movie just came out like 2 weeks ago, to Renaissance fairs, which are honestly more about medieval culture than they are about Renaissance culture, to sports teams, mascots, etc. The Middle Ages are everywhere. And it's important to note right up front that some of these uses of the Middle Ages are fine and lovely, right? Think of Disney movies and how they use the Middle Ages, or how a lot of modern fantasy literature or things like Dungeons and Dragons use a kind of medieval-esque setting. And others are terrible. And are in many ways misuses or abuses of the Middle Ages rather than uses of the Middle Ages. Think of how George W. Bush called the War on Terror a crusade, or look at really any nationalist movement in Western Europe and how they use the Middle Ages generally, or the Crusades specifically, to kind of create an antagonistic relationship between the East and the West, or something like that. There's as much abuse and misuse of the Middle Ages nowadays as there are uses of the Middle Ages. And Umberto Eco thought about this a lot, and he wrote quite a few essays on this subject, the most famous of which is an essay called Dreaming the Middle Ages. And in that essay he writes, "Since the Middle Ages have always been messed up in order to meet the vital requirements of different periods, it was impossible for them to be always messed about in the same way." And then he goes on to list out and describe 10 different little Middle Ages, is what he calls them. And I'll put a chart on screen that I made in which I kind of just define them, and I just quote from Umberto Eco's essay. And I'm sure for most of these, you could probably think of a few different examples of medievalism that could fit that criteria. And I've tried to give a couple different examples for some of them, though some of the categories are very, very complicated, and he has a very specific author or a very specific piece in mind. So I'd encourage you to go read his essay. It's not that long and it's pretty accessible online. And I won't go through each of these dreams, but it'll suffice to say that these are dreams. They are the audience's or the author's biases, fears, anxieties, and desires projected onto the Middle Ages. That is, none of these dreams are the Middle Ages, but they are our reconstruction of the Middle Ages. They're revisions of the Middle Ages, perhaps. I think it was Claude Lévi-Strauss who said that the reason why there's so many animals in literature is that animals are great to think with. And I think the same can be said of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are a great stage on which we can, stage certain ideas and think through those ideas. Think of how Game of Thrones, for example, gets at so many different moral and political philosophies and problems through their medievalism. And all of this is exactly what Umberto Eco does in Baudolino, which is a picturesque novel. It's a hilarious and fun and incredibly intelligent romp through the late 12th and early 13th centuries. It opens during the Sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, which, if you're unfamiliar with the Fourth Crusade, it's a pretty good one. It's the one when the Crusaders onboard Venetian ships sailing towards Egypt to attack Alexandria before leading an offensive north into the Holy Land to go and try to take back Jerusalem from the Muslim Sultanate that is in power there. And instead of following through on this plan, they decide to detour to the Greek Christian Constantinople and hang out there for a few months. And they spend the winter there. And they weren't really welcome in Constantinople for obvious reasons. I mean, you don't usually want a massive armed contingent of men hanging out bored in your city. And eventually the Latin Crusaders, unable to afford to continue paying the Venetian sailors who were bringing them to Egypt and to the Holy Land, eventually they decide to take and sack the city. And there's loads of reasons for this, obviously. It's a very complicated political maneuver, but the most simplified reason for why they eventually decide to sack the city is because many of the leaders of the Crusades were in debt, especially to the Venetians on whose ships they were sailing. So they needed money, and well, what's a better place to get money than one of the richest cities in the world within striking distance? This crusade often gets lost on people who want to bring back the Crusades. Well, actually, most of the history of the Crusades seems to be lost on these people. But this is an absolutely cataclysmic event that in some ways led to the slow decline of the Eastern Roman Empire, or what we now call the Byzantine Empire, though very importantly, they thought of themselves as a continuation of the Roman Empire. And we really need to emphasize how insane this event was. These were Christian soldiers from the West, Latin Christendom, who were besieging and eventually sacking the center of the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Eastern Roman Empire. These are Christians on their way to a holy war against Islam at the command of the Pope, Pope Innocent III, perhaps the most powerful Pope ever, stopping by one of the biggest cities in the world that is full of Christians, sacking it, looting it, and destroying parts of it, as well as killing plenty of innocent people. And I'll just actually read a passage from Baudolino. The text reads, "Down below there was a veritable river of flame. Arches were crashing to the ground. Palaces were collapsing. Columns were shattered. The fiery globes that rose from the heart of that conflagration consumed the more distant houses. Then the flames that had capriciously fed that inferno returned to devour whatever they had previously spared. Above, dense clouds rose, still ruddy at their lower edge, with the reflection of the fires, but of a different color, whether through a trick of the rising sun's rays, or because of the nature of the spices, the lumber, or other burning material that engendered them. Further, depending on the direction of the wind from different points in the city, aromas arrived of nutmeg, cinnamon, pepper, and saffron, mustard or ginger. The world's most beautiful city was burning, yes, but like a brazier of scented condiments." You can just imagine this juxtaposition between the wealth of this city. I mean, it's a massive, massive city, and just watching it burn down at the hands of Christians. And of course, many people lament this attack. One of which is Master Nicetas, who's one of our main characters, and he's a guy who Baudolino just happened to have saved during this sack of Constantinople. So right after Baudolino saves him, he turns to Baudolino and says, "Oh my good lord, thank you for your aid. This means that not all Latins are wild beasts with faces distorted by hatred. Not even the Saracens acted this way when they reconquered Jerusalem, when Saladin was content with a handful of coins to guarantee the safety of the inhabitants. How shameful for all Christendom, brothers against armed brothers, pilgrims who were to recover the Holy Sepulchre, but have allowed themselves to be halted by greed and envy, and are destroying the Roman Empire. O Constantinople, Constantinople, mother of churches, princess of religion, guide of perfect opinions, nurse of all learning, now you have drunk from the hand of God the cup of fury, and burned in a fire far greater than that which burned the Pentapolis. What envious and implacable demons have poured down on you the intemperance of their intoxication? What mad and odious suitors have lighted your nuptial torch? O mother, once clad in gold and imperial purple, now befouled and haggard, and robbed of your children, like birds imprisoned in a cage. We cannot find the way to leave this city that was ours, nor the strength to remain here, but instead, sealed within many errors, we roamed like vagrant stars. It's really wonderful writing, but it's really emphasizes the fact that one of the greatest cities in the West is burning down around them as the rest of this book takes place. So it's right after this sack, like literally the night of, that Baudolino just kind of wanders into Constantinople, unaware of the sack, and he stumbles upon Master Nicetas and saves his life, as I just said. And this Master Nicetas, who we just read a quote from, and whom Baudolino saves, was a real historian who ended up writing this massive history of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's a very fundamental text for anyone who wants to understand the Byzantine Empire. And already we see what Umberto Eco does best, which is mix history with fiction. That night though, right after Baudolino saves Nicetas, Baudolino begins telling this story, this very long story, about his own life. And this is kind of the meat of this book. Baudolino's exceptionally lucky and strange and wonderful life. But this book, of course, isn't that simple. There's this pretty straightforward frame narrative that's pretty common to use, but Baudolino is no ordinary storyteller. He's a liar and a trickster, but he tells this fantastical story of how he grew up in a town in Italy called Alessandria, which is the same town that Umberto Eco grew up in, by the way. How Baudolino became essentially an adopted son of Frederick Barbarossa, the king of Germany and Burgundy and Italy, and of course, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was not to be confused with the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, of course. As well as how Baudolino went on this quest in search of the Holy Grail and into the mythical lands of Prester John. And we'll come back to that last point in just a minute. But after talking for a while, Nicetas interrupts Baudolino and says to him, "You are like the liar of Crete. You tell me you're a confirmed liar and insist I believe you. You want me to believe you've told lies to everybody but me? In all my years at the court of these emperors, I have learned to extricate myself from the traps of masters of deceit far more sly than you. By your own confession, you no longer know who you are, perhaps because you have told too many lies, even to yourself, and you're asking me to construct a story that eludes you? But I'm not a liar of your class. In all my life, I have questioned the stories of others in order to extract the truth." Nevertheless, Baudolino keeps speaking, and Nicetas keeps listening. And Baudolino talks about how, as a boy, he was gifted with languages, and so he was sent to Paris to study at the university there, where he meets all of these people who are all of these like really interesting references to real historical people. This book really needs to have like an annotated edition published, because even I certainly missed many of the references, and I've been fortunate enough to read quite a bit of medieval history and medieval literature. But the most important thing that Baudolino learns in Paris at the university is of these mythical lands out east, and the mythical land of Prester John. He read of distant lands where crocodiles live, great aquatic serpents that, when they have eaten a man, weep, move their upper jaw and have no tongue, the hippopotami, half man and half horse, the Lucronian beast with the body of an ass, the behind of a stag, the breast and thighs of a lion, horse's hooves, a bifurcated horn, a mouth stretching to the ears from which an almost human voice emerges, and in the place of teeth, a single bone. He reads of lands where there lived men without knee joints, men without tongues, men with huge ears that sheltered their body from the cold, and the sciapods, who run very swiftly, on a single foot. And of course, the most important fantastical land that Baudolino hears of is the land of Prester John. But when he came to India, Baudolino almost forgot Beatrice, and his mind turned to other fancies, because he had got it into his head that in those parts there had to be, if there ever had been, the kingdom of that presbyter Johannes, of whom Otto had told him. Baudolino had never ceased to think of Johannes. He thought of him every time he read about an unknown country, and even more when on the parchment varicolored miniatures appeared of strange beings like horned men or pygmies who spend their lives fighting cranes. He thought of this so much that, to himself, he now spoke of Prester John as if he were a family friend, and hence to discover where he was became for Baudolino a matter of the greatest moment. And if Johannes was nowhere, still in India had to be found where he could be placed, because Baudolino felt bound by an oath, though none had been sworn, to his beloved dying bishop. So he becomes enthralled with this mythical and legendary land of Prester John. And if you're unfamiliar, Prester John is this legendary king who is supposed to rule this Christian kingdom way out east, somewhere in India, according to most medieval maps. And importantly, this mythical land is supposed to be either right next to the earthly paradise, or it is the earthly paradise, depending on which tradition you're following. But it was an incredibly popular legend and myth in the Middle Ages. There's a ton written about it in the Middle Ages. And I'll actually put up some pictures right now of the Hereford Mappa Mundi, the map of the world, which was written, which was drawn right around the year 1200, right? Kind of when this book is supposed to be taking place. And this is a super famous map. I'll leave some links down below. It's worth checking out and just kind of zooming in into random spots. You'll find all sorts of fantastic creatures. And just to orientate you, if you're unfamiliar with medieval maps, the top is east and the left side is north, and so on. So you can see on the left side Europe, and on the right Africa, and the top Asia, which are the three continents that make up the world, of course. And right in the middle is Jerusalem, as always. But you'll see at the very, very top of the world, in the Far East, the earthly paradise. And in fact, just above that, you'll see Jesus Christ himself. But this is really important for a medieval worldview, because this means that an earthly paradise exists, which makes logical sense if you've read Genesis, right? They just sort of walk out of the Garden of Eden and multiply throughout the world. But this created a desire and an eagerness to search for this earthly paradise throughout the Middle Ages. And there's dozens of stories from the Middle Ages of people going out and searching for these lands. The most famous of which in English is certainly Sir John Mandeville's Travels, which I won't get into now, but it's an incredibly popular, like insanely popular travel narrative from the 14th century. Medieval people loved this stuff. So in the Far East, there's the lands of Prester John and the earthly paradise, but everyone knows journey before destination. And we can look at the Hereford Mappa Mundi, and what we'll find are all these fantastic creatures and animals and people. We have the Cynocephaloid, the sciapods, also called unipeds, or in Old Norse, the Einfættingarmaður, the one-legged man. There's one in North America, apparently, according to, I believe it's Eric the Red saga, one of the Vinland sagas. And there's also the Blamier, etc. These are pretty common creatures in the Middle Ages. There are depictions of these creatures in the Beowulf manuscript, for example, which I talked about in a previous video. But most of these creatures all kind of go back to this 7th century Spanish historian named Isidore of Seville, who was using a lot of the stuff from the Roman historian Pliny the Elder's natural history. So the world, especially the faraway world, right, the edges or the margins of the world are filled with these creatures. And in Baudolino, on his journey to the east, he actually encounters a lot of these creatures. Like in a modern fantasy series where the protagonist has to spend a summer or two with the elves or the dwarfs or the ents or something like that, Baudolino lives among some of these creatures and learns a lot from them. And this part of the novel is just incredible. He has these long conversations with this sciapod and even falls in love with a satyr-like creature. I won't get into too many details here because what I'm interested in this video is, why does Umberto Eco tell this story? What does it do? Well, for one, Eco is really interested in legendary worlds. He wrote this incredible book, which came out, I think, in 2013, the Book of Legendary Lands, which is just kind of one of the prettiest books that I own. It has like these amazing illustrations. I'll do some B-roll of it right now. But one of the reasons why he's so interested in these legendary worlds, these fictional worlds that people create, is because he's a semiotician. He studies semiotics, which is basically just, the study of signs and symbols and how we make meaning or interpret meaning from those symbols. And in some ways, for Eco, these legendary lands are signs or symbols that we read meaning through. He writes in the introduction to the Book of Legendary Lands, but here we are interested in lands and places that now or in the past have created chimeras, utopias, and illusions, because a lot of people really thought they existed or had existed somewhere. That said, there are still many distinctions to be taken into account. They are legends about lands that certainly no longer exist, whereas it cannot be ruled out that they may have existed in ancient times. And this is the case with Atlantis, the last traces of which many perfectly sane people have tried to find. There are lands mentioned in many legends and whose existence, albeit remotely possible, is doubtful, such as Shambhala, to which some people attribute a purely spiritual existence, and others that are undoubtedly the effect of narrative fiction, such as Shangri-La, but imitations of which are constantly produced for gullible tourists. There are lands whose existence is asserted only in biblical texts, such as the earthly paradise, or the country of the Queen of Sheba. But it was belief in such places that prompted many, Christopher Columbus included, to discover lands that really did exist. There are lands created by false documents, such as the land of Prester John, which nonetheless persuaded explorers to travel through both Africa and Asia. Finally, there are places that really exist to this day, even though sometimes in the form of ruins, but around which a mythology has grown up, such as El Alamut, over which hovers the legendary shadow of the assassins, or Glastonbury, which now associated with the myths of the Grail, or René Le Chateau, or Guissos, which have been made legendary by very recent commercial speculation. In short, legendary lands and places are of various kinds and have only one characteristic in common. Whether they depend on ancient legends whose origins are lost in the mists of time, or whether they are an effect of modern invention, they have created flows of belief. The reality of these illusions is the subject of this book. It's a brilliant book, and perhaps I'll do a full review of that book sometime in the future. But like Baudolino's story, which is a mix of fact and fiction, these legendary lands that humans have always created are a mix of reality and illusion. But it's in this mixing that we create meaning. I think this idea is actually quite similar to J.R.R. Tolkien's idea of creating a secondary world, though they're perhaps a bit different. So it's really important for Eco that Baudolino isn't just a straightforward historical novel, but one that mixes fact and fiction for many reasons. One, this is the MO of medieval literature, right? We like to think that there's a difference between fact and fiction, but a lot of medieval writers didn't really care too much about that difference. This isn't to say that they didn't know the difference or they couldn't spot it or something like that. But for medieval writers, for example, King Arthur was a real king who had real knights. But medieval writers could continue to make up all these stories about King Arthur and his knights and sort of play with this history in a way that would make many modern historians queasy and many modern literary studies people really giddy. The Middle Ages is full of what we would call the supernatural or the paranormal or the fantastic. These things weren't separate from reality though. Indeed, the language of calling them supernatural isn't quite right, as they aren't above reality. Paranormal is probably a better term because they're, alongside or next to reality. The medieval world has all of these monsters and creatures and different kinds of humans, just as our world is full of fantastical monsters, creatures, and strange lands. The word monster comes from the Latin monstrare, which means to demonstrate or to reveal or something like that, after all. Monsters depict the limits of human understanding. We create them in order to attempt to create order out of chaos. And in that way, we aren't really so different from the medieval map makers who placed monsters all throughout our own world. And is there really a better time to explore all of these notions than during the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade? Remember that during the night that Baudolino is telling this fiction that becomes this book, Constantinople is burning down just outside their windows. Reality seems to matter less than the reality of the stories that we tell ourselves. We can learn more about ourselves by studying the latter because, well, we're all storytellers, and all storytellers are liars. Baudolino isn't a historical fiction novel, but it's a novel about the fiction of history. It's about the uses of history and the study of the fantasies of history. Truth and fact matter less for Eco. What matters for him is the stories we tell and the fictions we create. And of course, because he's Umberto Eco, this is a, fictional book about a fictional character giving a fictional account of a fictional land. But the story is real, right? I'm holding it right here. There's an interview with Umberto Eco in La Repubblica in which the interviewer asks if this book is an apology for the lie, presumably the lie of history or something like that. And Umberto Eco responds, "Rather, it is an apology for utopia, for those inventions that move the world. Columbus discovered America by mistake. He thought the Earth was much smaller. It is not true that he was the only one thinking it was around, as people say. That it was around they knew before Plato. And what can be said about El Dorado? A continent is conquered following a myth. So it seems that one use of the Middle Ages is a place and a setting and a time to stage these ideas, because a lot of these ideas seem very foreign to our modern, rational, post-Enlightenment ideals. But as Eco shows, both we and the people of the Middle Ages rely on fiction and fantasy, especially in our history books. Baudolino is about the power of lies, the power of fiction and of imagination. As Baudolino says to Master Nicetas, who's again this very important historian of the Eastern Roman Empire, and whose history we rely on to understand that time period. Baudolino says, "You know, Master Nicetas, when you say something you've imagined, and others then say that's exactly how it is, you end up believing it yourself." So is the history we read by Master Nicetas, is he just quoting Baudolino? Is he just telling Baudolino's story? Umberto Eco is a wonderful thinker, whose books I'm getting more and more into. So let me know if you would like more videos on his fiction or his studies of medievalism and a lot of his theories about medievalism. I have a lot more thoughts on Baudolino. It's a pretty hefty book with a lot going on, but I thought this might be an interesting way to approach it. But let me know what you think. And for now, thanks for watching.